Hello, patricians, and welcome to the third episode of the Gigachad Book Club. In early September of 1987, a book appeared on the shelves of local bookstores by a relatively unknown author named Haruki Murakami. In the following years, his would become a household name, not only in Japan, but all over the world. This is the story of Norwegian Wood, the book that changed literature forever. If there was one book I could recommend to someone as an introduction to Japanese literature, it would be Norwegian Wood. It's a story of profound loss in a turbulent time, of people choosing between the past and the future, of people who can move on, and people who cannot. Before we begin our deep dive into this masterpiece, let us talk about the author, the illustrious Haruki Murakami. Born in 1949, Murakami is, for our purposes, the youngest and most modern of the authors we've looked at. His father was a veteran of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the scars he bore from the horrors he saw were passed down to his son. Raised as he was in the growing middle class of the 50s and 60s Japan, Murakami managed to avoid the pitfalls that his literary predecessors had fallen into. He would not give in to the temptations of vice and gluttony as Dazai had, nor would he allow himself to be hooked by the same fanatical patriotism that had cost Yukio Mishima his life. Instead, Murakami would choose another path, the path of moderation and deep introspection. Through his years, Murakami bore witness to a country that had been set adrift, a Japan that struggled with a proud military history, coming to terms with a new government that had stripped such honor away. And while the post-war economic boom had lifted many out of destitution, the shame that had consumed much of the populace would leave many in a state of spiritual bankruptcy. Murakami's attitude towards society and the people in it is explored at length in the vast majority of his novels, but nowhere is it done better than in Norwegian Wood. So, without further ado, let's begin our discussion of the greatest story ever written. Norwegian Wood begins in a unique way. We meet Toru, a man in his mid-30s who is on board a plane that is about to land in Germany. As the aircraft taxis to the gate, he hears the Beatles' song Norwegian Wood begin to play, plunging him into memories of his college days and his first love with a girl named Naoko. We are treated to a brief memory of Toru and Naoko walking through a meadow. An exchange of dialogue tells us all we need to know about Naoko's diminishing mental health, and by the end of the chapter, we are aware that she will not long remain in the world of the living. The first chapter ends poignantly with the line, "The thought fills me with an almost unbearable sorrow, because Naoko never loved me." What follows is an account of Toru's early college years, between the ages of 18 and 20, and primarily revolves around the relationship he has between two different women, Naoko and Midori. And while this book has a host of minor characters that expand the narrative immensely, I'd like to focus on these three, as they are the driving force of everything that happens from beginning to end. First, let's talk a little bit more about Toru. By all accounts, Toru seems to be an above-average guy. He is studious, although he has no certain path that he is following through life. He is extremely fit and active. He is well-read in foreign literature, and has a good grasp of other languages. Despite being intelligent and moral, however, Toru is not immune to falling into certain traps, especially concerning Naoko, which we will explore later. If I had to describe Toru in a word, it would be sophomoric, the wise fool. Although in this case it might be less foolishness and more youthful naivete. While perceptive, he sometimes causes more harm than help with his words. But it's these small flaws which breathe life into his character, making him feel like an accurate portrayal of a young man trying to find his way in early adulthood. Next, let's talk about Naoko. Naoko was the girlfriend of Toru's childhood best friend, Kizuki, who committed suicide at the age of 17. Kizuki's death is the catalyst that drives Naoko to despair, for while Toru manages to move past the loss of his only friend, Naoko is forever haunted by his memory. Her heart is a forest of regrets for things that could never be. In the book, Naoko represents Toru's past, the things he desperately wants to cling to: youthful innocence, puppy love, simple times and simpler pleasures. Much of what we know about Naoko comes from her talks with Toru during his visits while she is in convalescence. Naoko is beautiful and kind, but she is controlled completely by the events of her past. So much so, in fact, that by the end of the book, she is experiencing audible hallucinations of Kizuki, as well as her sister, who also committed suicide as a teenager. Despite her severely depleted mental health, Naoko is not without a good grasp on the effect she has on the people around her. If nothing else, I believe she knew that her death would be the only way for Toru to be free of the past that chained him down, just like it had done with herself. Finally, let's talk about Midori. Midori is the exact opposite of Naoko in almost every conceivable way. She is tomboyish, outgoing, and crude. Being a classmate of Toru's, she knows next to nothing of his past, or of the nature of his relationship with Naoko. And while Midori has her own trauma that she deals with, she never seems to let it get the better of her. In the book, Midori represents Toru's future. Not the things that he wants, but the things that he needs. Not only does she represent this in the allegorical sense, but also in the physical and mental sense. Midori is sexual and intelligent. She values freedom and modernity, which can be seen in the words she chooses and the clothes she wears. Unlike Naoko, she allows herself to feel her emotions and lashes out at Toru for his failures, but just as quickly comes around, and before you know it, she's back at Toru's side, ready to keep walking into the future. I want to take a moment now to talk a little bit about the setting, because I believe in many ways the setting reflects a lot of the themes and dilemmas that our characters face. Some of the burning questions we have might be answered by looking at the places and times that make up the backdrop of Norwegian Wood. First, let's talk about the time period. The events of Norwegian Wood take place between 1968 and 1970, during the height of the Cold War. While most Westerners might associate that time period with events such as Vietnam and the Apollo 11 landing, these events are entirely inconsequential to the narrative we are exposed to. While we are exposed to the political unrest that existed in Japan in the period, it doesn't play a large part in the narrative, nor does it affect the characters beyond being a mild nuisance. And remember, this is the same time period that Yukio Mishima led his attempted coup. What we do see, however, are several philosophies presented by the changing of the times. Toru's roommate, Stormtrooper, is very Mishima-esque in his behavior. He leads a structured, clean, ultra-disciplined existence, and though this annoys Toru at times, it provides him with some benefit as well, including develop his own sense of cleanliness and routine. In contrast, we see the largely unsuccessful leftist movements of the age as well, something Toru is immensely critical of, even to the point of being dismayed that all these so-called activists go back to just being normal students after causing such a clamor. In spite of this, Toru becomes something of a rebel himself, choosing not to answer when his name is called in class, and even skipping classes here and there to spend time with Midori. Toru keeps a mature and distanced view of both extremes. He absorbs the necessary discipline and structure needed to succeed in life from Stormtrooper, as well as takes value in both the freedom and rebellious spirit offered by the leftists. By the end, he finds himself somewhere in the middle of the two, which is similar to how he finds himself between Naoko and the Midori. In the same vein, let's look at the setting. The book takes place primarily in two locations: the university in Tokyo and its surroundings, and the convalescent home in Kyoto where Naoko lives. One might ask, why Kyoto? And that is answered by Naoko herself. Naoko, the connection to Toru's past, goes to live in the city that most represents Japan's past. Toru remains in Tokyo, the new capital, the symbol of 20th century technological and societal progression, where, consequently, Midori also lives. Just like Toru is having to make his choices in love and in life, Japan as a country is also making choices between its past and its future. All of this harmonizes together beautifully, giving us an answer to perhaps the novel's biggest, yet also least important question. Does Toru end up with Midori in the end? The reason I say that this question is ultimately unimportant is because, at the end of the day, this is not a romance novel. It's not trying to set up a happily ever after ending. This is a human story about people and the choices they make. Some who surrender their lives without a fight. Some who give everything they have to rip off the chains of the past, only to fail. Some who are beholden to no one and nothing, and move forward with cold indifference. Each character, each behavior, each choice is thoroughly described, giving even the most insignificant players in this book a voice that is added to its beautiful chorus. Murakami takes a risk telling the reader at the very beginning how this book is going to end, and that risk pays off in spades. And perhaps the biggest theme that binds everything together here is that of death. I've always believed that the mark of a good story is how it addresses the importance of death. Not only for the character who dies, but for the ones left behind that are forced to live on. In our last episode, we read Confessions of a Mask by Yukio Mishima, and one of the heartbreaking things in that story is the almost callously sadistic attitude that the main character has not only for his own death, but the deaths of others. While Mishima does all he can to praise the idea of a violent death no matter how needless, Murakami takes the exact opposite approach. Every death in this novel takes an enormous toll on the survivors. Even the deaths of characters that happened long before or after the events of the book, from Naoko's sister to Nagasawa's girlfriend, each one sticks to our main characters and to us like glue. They weigh upon us with the exact weight that death should weigh upon every person. Does Toru end up with Midori? Do they get married and have kids and have a house with a dog and a cat? We don't know. We will never know. And that isn't what matters. What matters in the end is what Toru chooses. At the end of everything, Toru calls Midori. He reaches out to her despite the torrent of emotions and pain he has experienced in his young life. Toru chooses the future. He chooses Midori. It's a powerful message for everyone who reads this book. The scales of life are not even. Sadness will always outweigh happiness. But the courage to rise again each morning and face the day is a decision all of us must make for ourselves. And when the chains of the past rise to swallow another victim, all we can do is pick up the pieces and keep moving forward. Thank you all for joining me in today's episode. What did you think of this book? Was there a certain character or scene that stood out to you? Sacrifice a comment to the algorithm gods below. And we'll see you in the next episode, covering Natsume Soseki's Botchan.